Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7.
It's great to be here.
Today we're going to look at something that really forces you to check your own engine. And when I say engine, I don't mean the car in your driveway.
Right.
I mean the mental operating system that, drives you to get out of bed in the morning. We are talking about the ultimate concepts, God, belief, and the massive void that's left when real faith just evaporates.
It's a huge topic. We're basically asking, does your view of the divine drive you to build civilizations? Or does it convince you that, the best thing to do is just sit back and do nothing?
Exactly. Does your internal software tell you to conquer the world, or does it tell you the world is a lie? We're diving into a classic heavyweight text today, Zihniyet ve Dinor, Mentality and Religion, by the Turkish sociologist Sabri F. Ilginer.
A really foundational text.
It is. And this isn't just a history lesson. It's like a diagnostic of the soul. We're looking at how the mental engine of whole societies gets built and what happens when that engine just stalls out.
And Ilginer is doing something really fascinating. He's unpacking how religious interpretation, specifically within the Islamic world and this mystical tradition of Sufism, or Tasawwuf, how that shaped the economic destiny of the Middle East.
Compared to the West.
Compared to the West, exactly. He's exploring this transition from, let's call it an active God, to a kind of passive fatalism.
Before we get too deep into the philosophy, and believe me, we are going to get deep, I just want to throw this out there. If you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button.
Yeah, it really helps us keep these deep dives coming.
It does. So to really get the magnitude of what Ilginer is doing, we have to start with the giant he was wrestling with, Max Weber.
Of course. You have to start with Weber.
Right, the Protestant ethic guy. I feel like everyone hears about him in college and then kind of immediately forgets the details.
They do, but the details are everything here. The big question on the table is, why did the Industrial Revolution, modern capitalism, all this explosive economic growth, why did it take root in the West but not in, say, the Ottoman Empire?
Especially when, just a few centuries earlier, the Middle East was arguably way ahead in science, trade, you name it.
It's the billion-dollar question, right? And Weber's answer was basically, it's the software running in your head.
It's a good way to put it.
So Weber argued that Protestantism, specifically Calvinism, created a specific type of person. Now, this is important. The Calvinist God wasn't some friendly, forgiving figure.
No.
He was distant, terrifying, and absolutely demanding. And he had already decided, before you were even born, if you were going to heaven or hell. That's predestination.
Which sounds like a recipe for, I don't know, absolute existential dread.
Yeah.
If it's already decided, why do anything?
That's the paradox. That's the genius of it. You couldn't change the decision, but you were desperate for a sign. Just a hint. Am I one of the chosen?
Oh, okay.
So they decided that success in your work, in your calling, that was a sign of God's favor.
So anxiety drove them to work harder. It wasn't greed. It was like panic about the afterlife.
Precisely. It created what he called worldly asceticism. You work like a monk, incredibly hard, but you do it out in the marketplace. And crucially, you don't spend the money on fun stuff.
Right, no fancy clothes, no big feasts.
You reinvest it, and that accumulation of capital is what builds capitalism.
Okay, so that's the West. Now, here's where it gets pretty controversial. Weber looked at Islam and basically said, this system can't do that.
Yeah, Weber was pretty harsh, and Ilginer's the first to admit that. Weber saw Islam as either a warrior religion, all about conquest and feudalism,
Right.
or, in its mystical form, a religion of flight from the world. Basically, you're either fighting for booty or you're meditating in a cave. Neither one of those builds a factory.
That feels like such a massive generalization. I mean, the Silk Road, the bazaars of Istanbul, these were not built by people hiding in caves.
And that is exactly where Ilginer steps in. He respects Weber's method, the idea that religion shapes the economy. But he says Weber just got the data on Islam totally wrong.
He argues that Weber's view is too static.
Way too static. He says, look at the origins. Islam wasn't born in a monastery like Christianity. It wasn't born in a feudal castle. It was born in Mecca and Medina.
Among merchants.
Among merchants. This was the part of the book that really blew my mind. Ilginer points out that the language of early Islam is incredibly transactional. It reads like a business ledger.
It really does. God is portrayed almost as the ideal merchant.
Yes. The whole relationship between you and God is described with commercial metaphors. You invest your soul. You make a trade for salvation. The Quran is just filled with terms like weighing, measuring, profit, and loss.
So originally, God wasn't telling you to sit under a tree and wait for an apple to fall on your head.
No.
He was telling you to get to the market and make sure your scales were balanced.
Exactly. It was rational, it was active. And there was this huge tension in early Islamic society between what he calls muruvvet and diyanet.
Okay, let's define those because that seems like a key cultural clash.
Yeah, it is. Muruvvet is kind of the old pre-Islamic code. Think feudal chivalry, the way of the warrior. It's about bravery, sure, but also about spending lavishly to show off your status.
A warrior doesn't count as pennies.
He throws a feast. Whereas Diyanet was the new urban piety. It was about calculation, modesty, earning an honest living. It was a struggle between the sword and the ledger.
So if the software started out with work hard, be rational, trade is good,
Mm.
how we end up with the stereotype of the slow fatalistic East? If the source code was good, where did the virus come from?
That is the absolute core of Olginer's thesis. He calls it the shift from active Islam to passive mysticism, the great inward turn.
And this wasn't just like a random theological debate. This was political,
Well,
right?
completely political. As the government became more and more oppressive, Olginer points to the Umayyad era and beyond. The average person just felt totally helpless.
You can't change the Sultan.
You can't change the laws. So when you can't change the world outside, you turn inward. You have to, just to save your sanity.
And this is where we get into those concepts of Zahir and Batin.
Right. Crucial terms. Zahir is the outer legalistic layer of religion. The rules, the rituals, the Sharia law. Batin is the inner, hidden, mystical meaning. As people turned to the Batin, to Sufism, they started to reinterpret everything.
It's like they kept the same vocabulary words, but swapped out the dictionary definitions to suit a passive lifestyle.
That's a perfect way to put it. The terms were hollowed out and refilled with a new meaning that encouraged doing nothing.
Okay, let's unpack a few of these because this is where the mental engine gets totally rewired.
Yeah.
Take the word tawakkul. We usually translate that as reliance on God.
Or trust in God. And originally, tawakkul was an active, almost military concept. It meant you make a plan, you work your butt off, you take every single precaution, and then,
Then you trust God.
once you've done everything humanly possible, you trust God for the outcome. It's that famous saying, tie your camel, then trust in God.
Because if you don't tie the camel, it runs away. And that's on you, not God.
Precisely. But the mystics changed it. As this passive mentality took over, tawakkul shifted to mean just passive resignation. The metaphor became the bird.
The bird.
Yeah. They would quote stories about birds. A bird doesn't farm, it doesn't have a retirement plan, it doesn't store grain, and yet God feeds it every single morning.
So the logic became, why are you stressing about business? Why plan for next year?
Just sit, be like the bird and wait for God to drop the worm in your mouth.
Wow. That is a massive shift in mentality. I mean, it sounds beautiful poetically, but economically, it's a complete disaster. If you think God loves the lazy bird, you are not going to invent the steam engine.
You're not even going to fix your roof. And this bleeds right into Kuzumet or Cater fate. In the active sense, acknowledging fate just means accepting God's ultimate knowledge. It helps you process grief. But in this new passive mentality, it became the ultimate excuse.
Why didn't you repair the bridge? Oh, it was Kismet that it collapsed.
Exactly. It negates human will. It just became a way to justify doing nothing. If it's all written down anyway, why struggle?
And then there's Zik. That's remembrance of God.
Right. Originally a periodic duty. You pray, then you go back to work. The Quran literally says, when the prayer is finished, scatter in the land and seek God's bounty. It's a command to go make a living.
But in the extreme mystical interpretation,
Zik became a constant state. You were supposed to be in a trance, repeating God's name, mentally detached from the world.
24/7.
Ideally, yeah. And if you're constantly in a trance, you cannot be focusing on the fine print of a business contract or the efficiency of your loom. It creates a total disconnect from material reality.
There's one more concept from Ogner that really stuck with me, and it deals with time. The idea of the fani dunya, the mortal world.
Ah, yes. This is the trap of time consciousness. Capitalism, and really any kind of civilization building, requires you to believe in the future.
You plant a tree that you won't see fruit for 10 years.
You build a company that only pays off in 20. But the mystic worldview emphasized that this world is fani, it's perishing, it's temporary, it's a deception.
So if the world is a sinking ship, why rearrange the deck chairs?
Exactly. Why build a stone house if you're leaving tomorrow? The mystic wants to live in the eternal now, that moment of connection with God. But an economy requires living in the future? This just severed the link between man and long-term planning.
And when time doesn't matter, speed doesn't matter, efficiency doesn't matter.
And that's where you get that cultural slowness that Western travelers were always complaining about in the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't laziness. It was a philosophical stance that basically says, what's the rush? We're all dying anyway.
Okay, but I want to push back a little here. Ilgener is fair about this, right? He makes it clear this wasn't all of mysticism. There was a countercurrent,
Yes.
a path that actually looked a lot like that Protestant ethic we were talking about earlier.
Yes. And this is maybe the most tragic part of the whole story. He introduces us to the Malami path.
The Mellas, I love this part. They sound like the undercover agents of spirituality.
That's a great description. The Malamis were a reaction against the lazy, showy, robe-wearing dervishes. Their motto was, Hak isinde hakabel breber, with God while among the people.
So no robes, no baking bowls.
They rejected all of it. They despised the idea of a holy man living off handouts.
So for them, working was a form of worship.
Absolutely. They valued cause earning a living. There's this fantastic anecdote Ulgener tells that just sums them up perfectly. People are talking to a Malami master about some great saint up in the mountains. They say, this man is so holy, he can walk on water.
Classic miracle stuff.
And the Malami master just listens and says, so what? A frog can do that.
Ouch. Okay, not impressed.
Then they say, but this other man, he can fly through the air. And the master just says, a crow can do that. They get frustrated and they ask him, well, who is a true saint then? What does a real saint do?
And the answer.
The master says, the true saint is the one who goes to the market, buys and sells, interacts with people, earns his living, and yet never forgets God for a single moment.
That is profound. It's finding the spiritual in the material world. That's almost exactly what Weber said the Calvinists did. The shop floor is the temple.
It is. It proves that Islam absolutely could have produced a capitalist ethic. The mechanism was there. But, and here's the tragedy Ilgener points out, this act of mysticism, it lost the war.
But why? If it was so much better for society, you get wealthier citizens, a stronger economy, why didn't it win out?
Because the passive version was much more useful for the political elite. I mean, think about it. If you're a sultan or an authoritarian ruler, what kind of population do you want?
One that doesn't complain? One that stays put?
Exactly. If you have a population that believes their poverty is kismet, it's just fate, that believes resisting authority is bad, and that sitting quietly is a form of worship, that is a very, very easy population to rule.
Whereas a bunch of empowered Malami merchants who think their work is holy, they might start asking where their tax money is going.
Precisely. They're trouble. So the Malami spirit was either absorbed or just pushed to the fringes, while the state supported the more fatalistic orders that created obedient subjects. The mental engine was deliberately tuned down to idle.
And over centuries, that tuning just becomes habit. Which brings us to the final and I think most haunting concept in the book, the caput mortuum.
The deadhead. It's an old alchemical term. In alchemy, after you boil everything down and you extract the spirit, the essence, there's this worthless, dusty residue left at the bottom of the flask.
That's the caput mortuum.
That's it. And Ilgener uses it to describe what happens when the religious spirit evaporates, but the social habits remain.
So the belief is gone, but the behavior stays.
Exactly. This is the condition of the modern world. Let's look at the West first. Weber himself argued that the Protestant ethic eventually lost the God part. People stopped working hard because they feared hell.
But they kept working hard anyway.
Right. The habit of methodical, grinding work just remained. That gives you what Weber called the iron cage of modern capitalism. People working themselves to death for no spiritual reason, just because that's what you do.
That's the Western caput mortuum, a machine without a ghost.
A machine without a ghost. Now look at the East. The deep spiritual seeking of the mystic, that genuine desire to dissolve into God that evaporates too, secularization hits everyone. But what is left behind?
The passivity, the slowness, the fatalism.
Exactly. The mystic ethic lost its deep spiritual motivation, but it left behind a residue of, a lack of time consciousness. You get people who aren't spiritual at all, but they still act like the bird waiting for the worm.
Ilgener uses the word calendar to explain this perfectly.
Yes. Originally, a calendar was a specific type of dervish who detached from the world for these very high spiritual reasons. It was a rigorous path. But today, if you call someone calendar in Turkish, what does that mean?
It just means someone who's kind of easygoing, maybe a bit messy, indifferent, like whatever happens, happens.
The spiritual core is gone. Only the shabby outer shell remains. That is the caput mortuum.
And he connects this directly to the economic consequences of the 19th and 20th centuries.
He argues that the slow, taking it easy attitude that Westerners criticized in the Ottoman world wasn't inherent. It wasn't genetic. It was a cultural product. It was the dead residue of centuries of misinterpreted mysticism.
It's such a tragedy when you frame it that way. Ulgener paints this picture where we lost the elixir, the true spiritual contentment, but we also lost the drive for true work. We got the worst of both worlds.
We did. And this is where the comparison hits so hard. The West kept the drive, but lost the meaning. And the result is anxiety and burnout. The East kept the passivity, but lost the peace. And the result is stagnation.
So, okay, what does this all mean for us today? We're not living in the Ottoman Empire. We're not Calvinists in the 1600s. Why does this matter to someone driving to work right now?
Well, if we zoom out, we are living in a world of these hollow shells. We have shed the deep religious meanings that built our civilizations. But the machinery, the mental habits, they're still running.
We're all operating on autopilot.
We are, and Ulgener's work raises this massive question for all of us. We have these empty shells, these habits of work or habits of leisure that used to be filled with God, and now they're empty, and nature abhors a vacuum.
So the question is, what are we pouring into them now?
Exactly. If the God part is gone, what's the new engine? Is it just consumerism? Is it nationalism? Is it just the pursuit of comfort?
Or for the workaholics, is it just success with a capital S?
Right. Because whatever we pour into that shell is going to determine the trajectory of the next chapter of civilization. Are we building a society of meaningless grind or a society of meaningless drift? Ulgener showed us how the mental engine was built. I think it's up to us to decide what fuel we're going to put in it now.
That is a heavy thought to end on. From the merchant god to the berg waiting for the worm, and finally to the empty machine just running on fumes. This has been a deep dive into Zinyet Vedin.
A fascinating journey.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. We'll see you in the next deep dive.